Her breath came ragged, lips parted, pulse pounding in a chaotic rhythm beneath soft alien skin that shimmered faintly in the dim cold light. She was crouched in the shadows of a rusted cage, a prisoner trapped behind thick bars that clanked. With every desperate movement, her large feline eyes reflected flickering flames of the distant torches, wide with fear and pain, but also a flicker of stubborn hope. The smell of blood, sweat, and iron filled the stale air, a brutal reminder of what awaited her beyond the cage, the slaughterhouse of the cruel and merciless. This was how it had always been for her kind, born into a world where beauty was a curse and strength was the only way to survive. They called her a prize, an exotic beast worth more dead than alive, but she refused to break. Her fur, soft and iridescent, was torn in places from rough handling, her hands and feet bruised and calloused from years of captivity. No one saw her as more than a commodity, an alien treasure to be butchered and sold, yet somewhere inside, beneath layers of pain and scars, a fire burned fiercely, a fire no cage could contain. The market was filthy, a tangled hive of scum and greed. Human traders and alien warlords bargained over lives as if they were cheap trinkets. Her kind had been hunted down, betrayed, and abandoned by their own, left as prey to the sharp knives and sharper eyes of this savage galaxy. She had watched friends fall to bloodthirsty buyers and predators, their screams swallowed by the night. The weight of loneliness crushed her, yet in the darkest corners of her mind, a strange thought sparked. Maybe, just maybe, not all humans were monsters. His hands were rough, trembling, and broke the silence of her bleak existence like a thunderclap. He wasn't like the others. No gleam of greed or cruelty in his eyes, only exhaustion and something she had never seen before, kindness. He was broke, a nobody by all accounts. A desperate man with dirt under his nails and the smell of failure lingering on his skin. Yet he looked at her like she was not a trophy, not a prize to be sold, but something worth saving. It was unthinkable, impossible, yet here he was, whispering words of hope in a world starved of it. Her heart hammered against the cage as he fumbled with the locks, hands shaking with desperation, but fueled by a determination that set his eyes ablaze. The guards were distracted, the shadows long and forgiving. Every second counted, every breath was a gamble. She wanted to believe this was real, that she was not doomed, that the nightmare might end. And yet, deep down, a sliver of doubt gnawed at her. What if it was just another trick? Another lie in a galaxy where mercy was a rare and dangerous thing. The cage door creaked open, and freedom tasted bitter and sweet all at once. As she slipped past the bars, the world outside felt both alien and alive, pulsing with unknown dangers and wild promises. She didn't know if this human could protect her, but she knew one thing for certain: she would fight. Not just for survival, but for something more, for trust, for hope, for a chance to rewrite the brutal story that had chained her for so long. And somewhere in the dark, that broke human carried a secret that would shake the very foundations of this merciless universe. The night outside the cage was a cruel mockery of freedom, thick with danger and whispered threats lurking in every shadow. The stench of decay and oil hung heavy in the air, blending with the distant hum of starships and the metallic clang of a galaxy that never slept. She moved with cautious grace, limbs aching but fueled by a raw, desperate energy she hadn't felt in years. The broken human stumbled beside her, clutching a battered bag filled with what little he owned, scraps of food, a flickering datapad, and hope, her feline senses twitched, alert to every sound, every breath that didn't belong. The sprawling city beyond the cage was a jungle of steel and neon, where predators hid behind faces of smoke and lies. She didn't understand this world, its harsh rules, its sharp edges, but the human's presence was a strange comfort. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice was low and steady, a lifeline in the chaos. His eyes darted nervously, haunted by debts and failures. But something fierce glowed beneath the weariness, a hunger to fight. Even when the odds were against him, they moved through the labyrinth of alleys and forgotten corridors, shadows, swallowing them like a predator closing in on prey. Every step was a gamble, every breath a prayer. The cages were just the beginning. Worse awaited in the underbelly of the city, where the black markets thrived on cruelty and blood. She could feel it, the distant drums of slaughterhouses, the cries of those still trapped in hell. She clenched her fists, nails digging into skin, the bitter taste of rage rising up. This was not just about escape. It was about breaking chains that had bound her kind for generations. The human's fingers brushed against hers once. Accidental but electric, a silent promise in the dark. Her pulse quickened, confusion and something tender stirring in the depths of her alien heart. It was maddening, this fragile connection between predator and savior, between captive and breaker of chains. She had spent so long hiding, surviving with claws and cunning, but now there was something more terrifying than any hunter, hope. And hope demanded courage, the kind she wasn't sure she still had. As they reached the edge of the city's forgotten docks, a chilling howl echoed across the water, a reminder that freedom was a prize fiercely contested. Figures emerged. From the darkness, shadowed silhouettes armed and hungry for payment or blood. The human froze, but she moved without hesitation, a blur of feline grace and raw power. Claws extended, eyes glowing with primal fire. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a force of nature, and the predators quickly learned that breaking her would cost more than they bargained for. The clash was brutal and raw, filled with screams and shattering bones. The human fought beside her, desperate and fearless in his own ragged way, wielding whatever he could find as a weapon. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but together they carved a path through the darkness, an unlikely duo bound by the fire of survival. The taste of victory was sharp, bitter, but real, and as the last attacker fled into the night, the human met her eyes with a breathless grin. This broken man, this desperate savior, had done the unthinkable. He had saved her, but freedom was just the first step in a war that neither of them could yet see. A war that would shake the stars and ignite a fury no one, not even the cruelest hunters, could control. Somewhere in the shadows, the slaughterhouse, masters were already planning their next move, and their rage would burn hotter than any flame. She was no longer prey. She was the spark. The docks reeked of salt and rust, but beneath the surface, a deeper rot pulsed like a heartbeat. The human and the alien catgirl pressed forward, adrenaline spiking through their veins, the narrow alleys closing behind them like a trap snapping shut. She felt every nerve alive with tension, every breath sharp with the taste of danger. The city was a beast, hungry and unpredictable, but for the first time in her shattered life, she had a companion, flawed, broke, but unyielding. His ragged breath mixed with hers as they ducked into a hollowed-out freighter, the cavernous metal belly a cold sanctuary. The human fumbled with his datapad, eyes scanning frantic messages, debts unpaid, bounties rising, and worse, rumors whispered in the darkest corners, a new wave of hunters hunting harder, bloodier, with technology that turned prey into ash before they even knew what hit them. The galaxy's cruelty was evolving, but so was something unexpected, a raw, reckless defiance burning in the human's gaze. She watched him, this broken man who risked everything for a stranger, and felt the weight of something she'd long buried, trust. It was fragile, a thin thread stretched tight between despair and hope, but it was there. Her fingers brushed the cold metal wall, claws retracting, heart thrumming with uncertainty. She had survived through cunning and claw. But now survival meant something more: alliance, resistance, maybe even revolution. The freighter's dim lights flickered, shadows dancing like ghosts on steel, and in the quiet, the human whispered. A name, something old, something forbidden. It was a name that carried weight, history, power. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the meaning. A plan, a purpose, a reckoning. They weren't just running from death. They were running toward something. A spark that could ignite the darkness. Outside, the city was waking, a sprawling nightmare of neon and steel, where secrets were currency and betrayal was the only law. She could hear the distant roar of engines and the cold echo of patrol drones sweeping the skies. Somewhere, the hunters were closing in, tracking the broken trail left behind by a desperate escape. They would not stop until the cage was sealed, until the price was paid in blood and fire. But she was no longer a prize to be claimed. The fire inside her had grown, fueled by the reckless courage of a human who had nothing but a broken past and a heart too wild to quit. Together, they were more than prey and rescuer. They were a promise of defiance, a whispered rebellion against a universe that had forgotten mercy. The freighter's hull groaned as the engine sparked to life, a low hum vibrating through the air. The human's fingers danced over controls, plotting a course into the unknown, away from the slaughterhouses and the shadows. The alien catgirl stood beside him, muscles coiled and ready, eyes shining with a fierce determination. The galaxy was vast, cold, and brutal, but somewhere out there was freedom. The freighter shuddered as it slipped from the docks, engines groaning against rusted joints like a beast reluctant to awaken. Outside the viewport, the sprawling cityscape shrank into a blur of neon veins and shattered hopes, swallowed by the endless black of space. The alien's heart hammered fiercely, a wild drumbeat against the cage of ribs, as unfamiliar stars burned coldly in the void. The silence between them was thick, not with comfort, but with questions too heavy to speak aloud. The human's fingers trembled on the console, eyes flickering with doubt and something darker, memories of debts unpaid, faces lost, and the crushing weight of failure. Yet beneath it all, a stubborn ember of defiance glowed, the kind that refused to die even when the world conspired to snuff it out. He wasn't a hero, far from it. Just a broke man with nothing left but grit and an unshakable will to keep moving forward. She watched him, muscles taut, senses sharpened by years of captivity and bloodshed. Every breath, every flicker of expression told her a story, a broken past layered with pain, but also the fierce, ragged hope of survival. She had been caged, hunted, and betrayed by the galaxy's cruelty, but here, in the cramped metal belly of the freighter, something new stirred. A fragile alliance, born from desperation and a shared hunger for freedom. Her thoughts drifted to the slaughterhouses, to the countless others still trapped in cages of steel and fear. waiting for the cruel hands of hunters to claim them. The galaxy was merciless, a predator that fed on the weak and discarded the broken like trash. But she refused to be broken. The fire inside her burned hotter now, fanned by the reckless courage of the human who had done the unthinkable, risking everything for a stranger, a nobody, a lost cause. Outside, the stars stretched cold and indifferent. But the human was charting a course toward the unknown, a place whispered about in the darkest corners, where hope was said to live and rebellion whispered on the winds. It was dangerous, a gamble against powers far beyond their reach, but it was a chance. And sometimes all it took was one chance to change everything. The hum of the engines pulsed through the hull like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. The alien's claws flexed against the cold floor, a reminder of the strength still within, raw and untamed. The human caught her eye and offered a crooked smile, tired but fierce. No words were needed. In that moment, the unspoken truth hung. Heavy between them, they were no longer just prey and savior. They were partners in a war that had only just begun. And as the freighter plunged deeper into the void, the galaxy's shadows lengthened behind them, hungry for revenge. But the fire that burned in two broken souls was a force no darkness could extinguish. The freighter's engines thrummed like a heartbeat, steady and relentless against the vast, empty black. Outside, stars scattered like cold diamonds, distant and indifferent to the tiny rebel spark flickering inside this battered ship. The alien catgirl pressed her palm to the cold metal wall, muscles coiled beneath soft fur, senses razor-sharp and restless. Freedom tasted strange, bitter and wild, but it was real. For once, she was not caged, not a trophy waiting for slaughter. She was moving, alive, and that alone was a revolution. The human sat hunched over the console, fingers flying over cracked screens, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was no soldier, no hero, just a broke man who'd gambled everything on a desperate hope. Every input, every course plotted, was a fight against the darkness, chasing them debts, bounties and ruthless hunters with eyes like knives. But even in his ragged exhaustion, something fierce burned a hunger to fight back, to claw free from the galaxy's crushing grip. She studied him, this fragile, flawed creature who had torn her from chains and slaughterhouses with nothing but courage and sheer, reckless will. His face was lined with failures and haunted by ghosts, but beneath the broken edges lay a stubborn heart that refused to surrender. It was maddening, confusing the way this man, so raw and vulnerable, had become her anchor in a universe that traded lives like garbage. Suddenly, alarms shattered the tense silence. Red lights bathing the cramped cabin in a harsh glow. The freighter lurched violently, metal screeching under unseen force. The human cursed low, scrambling over the controls as a barrage of sensors blinked warnings. The hunters had found them. The killers were closer than either dared hope, swift, merciless, and armed with technology that turned prey to ash before a scream could escape. Her claws flexed instinctively, eyes narrowing into glowing slits as the freighter shook from distant explosions. They were outmatched, outgunned, and trapped in the cold void with nowhere to run. But fear was a luxury neither could afford. She bared her sharp teeth, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap, while the human's voice cracked through the chaos, barking orders to himself and the failing systems. Every second was a desperate gamble. Every breath a defiant roar into the abyss. The galaxy wanted them dead, but they were not prey, not anymore. The alien's pulse hammered with wild fury. her mind racing through memories of broken cages and shattered friends, fueling a savage determination. If they were to die, it would be on their own terms, in a blaze of raw, unrelenting defiance. The freighter shuddered again, tearing through the star-streaked void toward an uncertain fate. Somewhere in the darkness, the hunters closed in like wolves circling their quarry. But she was not afraid, because beside her was a broken human who had done the unthinkable, and together they were about to show the galaxy what it meant. To fight back, the freighter rocked violently, alarms shrieking like banshees, tearing through the claustrophobic cabin, but the human's hands never faltered. Sweat slicked his brow, eyes sharp despite the pounding in his chest. The shadows outside twisted and pulsed with the approach of death, sleek, deadly ships gliding in like vultures drawn to fresh blood. The galaxy didn't care who they were, a broken man and an alien girl, or kings and queens. To them, they were nothing but prey to be crushed beneath cold boots. She crouched low, muscles rippling beneath fur, claws scraping the deck in readiness. Every sense screamed in overdrive, the hum of the engines, the vibrations in the hull, the faint static of incoming transmissions. This was no ordinary chase. These hunters weren't just bounty seekers. They were killers, architects of nightmares who thrived on fear and pain. The slaughterhouses were their playground, and she had once been their prize. Now she was there, target, and she would fight until the last spark of life burned out. The human gritted his teeth, voice rough as he barked orders to the ship's ancient systems. He wasn't a soldier, but desperation made warriors of men and monsters alike. His ragged breath filled the tight space between them as he worked frantically, fingers dancing across consoles in a desperate bid to stay one step ahead of death's shadow. The ship groaned under the strain, lights flickering as systems overloaded, but he refused to quit. Failure wasn't an option, not this time. Outside, the void was a tempest of streaking lasers and deadly missiles, a violent ballet, choreographed by hunters who thrived on chaos. The freighter dodged and weaved, a battered underdog clawing its way through a hailstorm of destruction. She moved beside him, a lethal predator poised to strike, eyes blazing with primal fire. The connection between them was electric, a wild pulse of trust and defiance in a universe that demanded submission. The human's hands tightened on the controls, lips pressed into a grim line. "Hold on," he muttered, voice rough but fierce. She didn't need the words. Every fiber of her being screamed with raw determination to survive, to fight, to carve a new path in a galaxy that had long forgotten mercy. They were more than victims. They were a spark in the dark, a blaze no hunter could smother. The freighter lurched suddenly, slipping through a narrow asteroid field, engines screaming in protest. The hunters followed relentlessly, shadows closing in, but the human's fingers flew over the controls with desperate precision. This was a war of wills, a brutal dance on the edge of oblivion, and neither of them was willing to lose. In the cramped cockpit, a fragile bond sealed in fire and fear burned brighter than any star. The galaxy could try to cage them again. It could send 1,000 hunters, drown the stars in blood and fire. But she was no longer prey, and this broke human. He was something else entirely, a wild, relentless force that refused to bow. Together, they were the unthinkable. The freighter plunged deeper into the asteroid belt, each jagged rock a threat that could shatter their fragile hope in an instant. The cockpit vibrated with the relentless barrage of attacks, alarms screaming as shields flickered and systems overloaded. Yet, amidst the chaos, the human's eyes burned with stubborn fire, exhaustion and fear, tangled with a fierce, unyielding will. They were running out of time, out of options, but surrender wasn't in his blood. She crouched beside him, muscles taut and ready, senses flaring with every heartbeat. The memory of steel cages and cold, merciless hands fueled a savage determination. She wasn't a helpless prize. She was a predator born of blood and fire, and she would tear apart anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. The hunters were closing in, but so was something else, a spark of rebellion, raw and dangerous, ignited by two broken souls daring to defy a universe that thrived on cruelty. The hum of the engines was a lullaby and a battle cry all at once, as the freighter weaved between asteroids, barely dodging destruction. The human's hands moved like lightning, a dance of desperation and hope on cracked controls. His ragged breath mingled with the steady rhythm of the ship's failing heartbeat. Every decision, every flick of a switch was a gamble against death. But he played it with reckless courage, because he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Outside, the void stretched cold and indifferent, but inside the cramped cabin, something fiercer burned trust. It was fragile, a thread woven from scars and fear, but it held them together in a world that sought to tear them apart. The alien's eyes met his, glowing with wild intensity, and in that silent exchange, a promise was made. They would not fall. Not to hunters, not to chains, not to the crushing weight of a merciless galaxy. Suddenly, the freighter shuddered violently, a blast ripping through the hull. The cabin jerked as lights flickered, systems sparking in rebellion. The human cursed under his breath, voice low and fierce as he fought to keep control. She sprang into action, claws extended, ready to defend their fragile sanctuary against whatever horrors might come crashing through the darkness. The battle wasn't just for survival, it was for a future no cage could contain. The asteroid field roared around them, a deadly storm of rock and ruin, but they were a single, blazing force, fierce, desperate, and unbreakable. The galaxy could try to swallow them whole, drown their rebellion in fire and blood. But they had something the hunters didn't, a wild, unshakable will to live, to fight, and to break every chain. And in the heart of the void, that was more dangerous than any weapon, the freighter's hull trembled under relentless fire, sparks raining like deadly stars from the fractured panels. Inside the cramped cabin, the alien catgirl moved with fluid grace, every muscle taut as a coiled spring, every sense on razor edge. Her eyes, luminous and fierce, scanned the flickering displays and the human beside her. He was battered, exhausted, but his spirit burned like a wild flame, refusing to be smothered by the galaxy's crushing darkness. His hands flew over damaged controls, fingers slick with sweat, weaving desperate commands to keep the dying ship alive. The alarms screamed, a cacophony of warning that clawed at their hope, but he didn't waver. Every breath was a battle, every second a gamble against a cold void threatening to swallow them whole. They were outmatched and hunted, but surrender was a word neither understood anymore. Her claws scraped the deck as she rose to her full height, muscles rippling beneath the soft glow of the flickering lights. The cold metal cage of their prison had been shattered, but the galaxy's hunters still prowled, relentless and merciless. She was no longer prey, she was a force of nature, raw and dangerous, forged in pain and defiance. Beside the broken human who had risked everything to save her, she felt something new, a fierce, fragile hope burning brighter than any star. The freighter lurched, sensors flashing warnings of incoming fire, and the human cursed under his breath. "We won't make it," he said, voice ragged but determined. She met his gaze, eyes shining with wild fire, and the silent answer was clear. They would make it, or die trying. Suddenly, a violent shudder rocked the ship as an explosion ripped through the rear hull. The lights flickered, and the stars outside fractured into jagged shards of light. The hunters were closing in, their cold, calculating machines hungry for their prey. But the alien's growl was a promise, a primal roar echoing through the void. They had escaped the cage, but the fight was just beginning. The human's fingers tightened on the controls, his face grim with resolve. "Hold on," he whispered, more to himself than her, as he pushed the freighter into a desperate maneuver. The ship surged forward, tearing through the asteroid belt with reckless abandon, engines screaming against the void's crushing silence. Every second was a lifeline, every heartbeat a drumbeat of defiance. They were hunted, broken, and desperate, but they were free, and in the cold darkness of space, that was everything. The freighter tore through the dense asteroid field like a wounded animal, jagged rocks scraping and rattling its battered hull. Inside, the alien catgirl crouched low, muscles taut and ready to spring. Eyes locked on the viewport where the cold, infinite stars stretched out, beautiful, merciless, and indifferent to their fight. The human beside her sat slumped over the console, face pale but determined, fingers flying over the failing controls with frantic precision. Neither of them spoke. There was no time for words, only action. The hunters were relentless, their shadowy ships weaving deadly patterns of pursuit through the void. Missiles streaked past, tearing at the freighter's shields, setting alarms screaming through the cramped cabin. The human cursed under his breath, sweat slicking his brow, the weight of every failure and debt pressing down like a crushing stone. But surrender was not an option, not after everything, not after the broken cages and stolen lives. She flexed, her claws, a low growl vibrating deep in her throat. Memories flashing, the cold bars, the bloodied floors, the screams swallowed by the night. The hunters wanted to break her, to turn her into nothing but flesh and fear. But she was more than that. She was the wildfire that refused to be tamed, a spark that no cage or bullet could extinguish. And beside her, this broken human held the kind of reckless courage that made legends. The freighter lurched suddenly as an explosion rocked the aft section. Alarms blaring as systems failed one by one. The human's fingers flew desperately, rerouting power, staving off the inevitable with sheer force of will. Outside, the hunters closed in like vultures, their sleek ships cutting through the void with deadly grace. The galaxy was a merciless predator, but this unlikely pair was something new, defiance incarnate. Her eyes met his, a fierce storm of gratitude and fierce determination. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on borrowed time, but they had each other. That was enough to burn down the darkness. The human gritted his teeth, voice hoarse but steady. "We're not done yet." Her answer was a growl, sharp and wild, a promise to fight until the stars themselves burned out. The freighter screamed through space, battered but alive, chasing freedom down a path strewn with fire and blood. The hunter's shadow loomed large, but the fire inside, two broken souls burned brighter, a light no darkness could ever claim. The freighter's hull screamed under the onslaught, a chorus of metal fatigue and electronic failure echoing through the tiny cabin. Outside, The void stretched cold and endless, speckled with distant stars that seemed oblivious to the desperate struggle unfolding within their harsh glow. The alien catgirl pressed herself against the console, muscles tight as bowstrings, every sense straining to catch the faintest whisper of danger. The human beside her was a storm of sweat and grit, eyes bloodshot but fierce, fingers dancing over cracked controls with a desperate urgency that bordered on madness. Their pursuers were relentless, shadows slipping through the void like hungry ghosts, armed with weapons that burned brighter than suns and struck with lethal precision. Each missile that screamed past was a reminder that death was never far behind. The human cursed voice, hoarse as he wrestled with the faltering systems, rerouting power with frantic fingers to keep the ship alive. Failure was unthinkable for her, for him, for the countless others still trapped in cages waiting for slaughter. She felt the fire rising within her, a raw, primal fury that had been forged in pain and defiance. The hunters wanted to break her, to reduce her to nothing but prey, but she was a storm wrapped in fur and claws, wild and uncontainable. Her eyes locked onto the humans, and in that silent exchange, a bond was sealed to broken souls, united by desperation and an unquenchable will to fight. The freighter shuddered violently as another blast rocked the aft section, alarms shrieking a discordant symphony of doom. The human's face was grim, jaw clenched against the tide of exhaustion threatening to swallow him whole. "Hold on," he growled, more to himself than her, fingers trembling but steady as he pushed the failing engines beyond their limits. The ship lurched forward, cutting a jagged path through the endless black, defiance blazing like a beacon in the void. Her claws scraped the deck as she sprang to her feet, ready to defend their fragile sanctuary against whatever horrors might breach the hull. The battle was far from over. It was just beginning. They were hunted, broken and desperate, but they were free. And in the cold silence of space, that was everything. The freighter shuddered violently as the final barrage slammed against its weakened hull, the groan of metal twisting like a dying beast. Inside, the alien catgirl crouched low, claws digging into the floor as the ship rocked uncontrollably. Her glowing eyes scanned every shadow, every flicker of light, searching for threats beyond the failing walls. The human beside her fought the controls with frantic desperation, every movement a battle against the sinking tide of failure. Their breaths mingled in the confined space, ragged, raw, and unbroken. Outside, the hunters closed in with cold. Precision, sleek death machines cutting through the void with ruthless intent. The galaxy was merciless, a predator with infinite teeth, but within this battered freighter burned a fierce defiance that no weapon could silence. She was no longer prey, no longer a caged animal waiting for slaughter. She was a wild force of nature, born of pain and rebellion, and beside her, the broken human was the spark that kept their fire alive. The alarms screamed a final warning as systems failed one by one. But surrender was a word neither knew. The human's hands moved with wild urgency, rerouting power, jacking engines beyond safe limits, a defiant howl against the cold void. His face was etched with sweat and determination, a broken warrior refusing to bow. She felt the surge of his resolve like a pulse, steady and fierce, binding them in a silent pact. The freighter lurched forward, a desperate surge through the star-streaked darkness, engines screaming against the crushing silence. Every second was a razor's edge, every breath a fragile lifeline. The hunters fired again, missiles slicing through space like death incarnate. But the ship dodged, weaving through the chaotic ballet of rocks and wreckage. The alien's claws gleamed in the dim light, her body coiled to strike, ready to defend their fragile hope with savage fury. They were hunted, broken, and desperate, but alive. And in the vast cold darkness of space, that was a victory no hunter could steal. The galaxy could try to cage them again, drown their rebellion in fire and blood. But this broken human and fierce alien catgirl were the unthinkable ablaze. Of defiance no shadow could snuff out. The freighter stumbled through the void, battered and bloodied, but breathing barely. Every system was a ragged gasp, every engine a cry of protest, but the ship still carried them forward, deeper into the cold black. The alien catgirl sat hunched against the bulkhead, breathing hard, muscles still coiled with tension, eyes flashing with a fierce, unyielding fire. The human slumped beside her. Exhaustion carved deep into his face, but his gaze was sharp, burning with a desperate hope that refused to die. Outside, the hunters circled like wolves, relentless and hungry. Their sleek ships gleamed with deadly promise, weapons humming with silent menace. They wanted to snuff out this fragile spark of rebellion, to turn to desperate souls back into prey and prize. But they underestimated the fire forged in the crucible of pain and defiance, the fire that roared inside them both, wild and untamed. The human's fingers trembled as he accessed ancient star charts, plotting a course through uncharted systems, a gamble born from desperation and raw courage. Somewhere out there, in the forgotten edges of the galaxy, was a place whispered about in rebellion's shadow, a sanctuary, a hope. It was dangerous, cloaked in mystery and legend, but it was the only chance they had. Freedom was not just a dream, it was a destination. She looked at him then, fierce and silent, a promise in her glowing eyes. They had survived slaughterhouses, betrayal, and hunters. They had escaped cages and death's cold grip. Now they would fight for a future not chained by fear and cruelty. Together, they were more than broken souls. They were the beginning of something new. The freighter's engines sparked weakly, the last reserves of power holding fast as they jumped into the unknown. The galaxy's shadows lurked behind them, but ahead was a void filled with wild possibility. Danger, yes, but also the chance for something better. The alien catgirl stretched, claws retracting as a strange calm settled over her fierce heart. The broken human beside her exhaled, a slow, steady breath that carried the weight of all they'd lost and all they might still gain. They were free. For now, but the real fight was just beginning. The stars outside flickered, like distant promises as the freighter slipped through uncharted space, fragile and battered but still alive. Inside, silence hung thick between the alien catgirl and the human, a silence heavy with unspoken fears and fragile hope. She traced patterns on the cold metal floor with sharp claws, muscles still trembling from the fight and flight, every fiber coiled for the battles yet to come. He sat beside her, fingers trembling as he stared at the flickering star maps, searching for a sanctuary whispered in rebellion's darkest corners. The galaxy was vast, ruthless, and unforgiving, a place where mercy was a forgotten myth and freedom was a flame snuffed out before it could ignite. But somewhere, beyond the brutal chokehold of the hunters and slaughterhouses, was a hidden refuge, a place where scars might heal and broken souls might find strength. It was a dangerous hope, wrapped in shadows and whispers, but it was all. They had left. She looked at him, eyes bright with a strange mixture of gratitude and fierce determination. This broken human, ragged, tired, and flawed, was the wild spark that had shattered her chains, Together, they were a defiant flame against the crushing darkness, a promise that even the coldest cage could not contain the fire of rebellion. Suddenly, the ship jolted violently, a warning siren screaming through the cramped cabin. The human cursed, scrambling over the console as sensors blinked warnings of an incoming threat. The hunters had tracked them once again, their cold, relentless pursuit far from over. They were outmatched, outgunned, and running on borrowed time. But surrender was a word neither understood. The freighter lurched forward, engines screaming as the human pushed it to its fragile limits, weaving through asteroid debris and cosmic hazards. The alien's claws dug into the floor, ready to spring, muscles coiled like a predator stalking its prey. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a war for freedom, for hope, for a future written in fire and blood. The galaxy might be cruel, but they were fiercer. And as the hunters closed in once more, they burned brighter, two broken souls, igniting a rebellion no darkness could smother. The freighter groaned under the strain, battered and barely holding together as the stars outside blurred past in streaks of light. The alien catgirl's body was coiled, tense like a spring, every nerve on edge, senses sharp as daggers in the dark. Her glowing eyes flicked from the viewport to the trembling human at the controls, whose hands moved with fevered desperation. Sweat ran down his brow, mixing with grime and blood, but his gaze was fierce, burning with a stubborn will that refused to break. The hunters had closed the distance again, sleek, deadly silhouettes cutting through the void with silent precision. Weapons primed to extinguish the fragile spark of rebellion. Missiles screamed through space, tearing past the freighter with destructive fury, each impact rocking the ship and shuddering their fragile sanctuary. But surrender was not an option. Not now, not ever. She sprang into action, claws flashing. Like lightning, muscles rippling beneath shimmering fur as the freighter lurched violently. The human cursed, voice raw and desperate, rerouting power to failing shields, pushing engines beyond safe limits. Every system screamed in protest, but the ship held barely. Their fate hung by a thread, fragile and wild as the fire burning between two broken souls. The alien's mind raced through memories of cages, cold metal, and bloodied floors. Memories that had forged her into the fierce creature she was now. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every stolen life, every broken spirit, every whisper of hope crushed by merciless hunters. And beside her, the human was more than a savior. He was a kindred spirit, a wild force of defiance bound by scars and courage. The freighter burst through the chaos, engines screaming as it dove into a nebula's swirling depths, a cloak of cosmic dust and chaos. The hunters hesitated, momentarily blinded, and the fragile duo seized their chance. The human's fingers flew over the controls, plotting a desperate course deeper into the unknown, toward a rumored haven where freedom might finally be more than a dream. The stars outside dimmed behind the swirling nebula, but inside, the fire between them burned brighter than ever. The galaxy could try to cage them again, drown their rebellion in blood and fire. But this broken human and fierce alien catgirl were the unthinkable, a blazing storm that no darkness could contain. The nebula swallowed the freighter whole, swirling colors of violet and blue masking their desperate flight through the cold void. Inside the cramped cockpit, the alien catgirl leaned against the console, muscles trembling from exhaustion but heart ignited with fierce hope. The human beside her wiped sweat and grime from his brow, eyes bloodshot but burning with raw determination. They had escaped the slaughterhouses, the cages, the hunters. But the war was far from over. Outside, the galaxy stretched, vast and indifferent. A canvas of stars, both cruel and beautiful. The rumors of sanctuary whispered in hushed voices across. The darkest corners called to them, a place where the broken could be whole, where freedom wasn't just a word but a living, breathing promise. It was a gamble, a wild roll of the dice against a universe designed to crush hope beneath cold boots. But they were gamblers, survivors, rebels. The freighter shuddered as the engine strained, holding together by sheer will and desperation. The humans' hands hovered over the controls, hesitating, then pressed forward, guiding them deeper into the unknown. The alien's claws retracted, but her gaze never wavered, sharp and fierce as the stars themselves. They had fought through fire and blood, through death's cold grip, and now stood on the edge of something new, a beginning forged in defiance and raw. Unbreakable hope. In that moment, two broken souls shared a silent vow, no matter what. Shadows lurked ahead. No matter how dark the galaxy became, they would fight. They would survive. They would carve out a future not chained by fear, not drowned in cruelty. The hunters might come for them again, but the fire inside was unstoppable. The freighter slipped through the nebula's veil, leaving behind a trail of sparks and broken chains. The alien cat girl and the broke human were no longer prey, no longer caged or doomed. They were a blaze of rebellion, wild, fierce and unthinkable, and the galaxy would never be the same.